All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's event, a lecture by Professor Magda Teter called Anti-Semitism and the Blood Libel. This is the first in our Daniel and Marissa class USC Shoah Foundation lecture series. And we want to give Daniel and Marissa class special thanks for their generous support for this lecture series. As I said, it's the first one in this group. And Daniel and Marissa class's generosity over the next 4 years will enable the USC Shoah Foundation to showcase leading scholars who will guide the audience through their latest research and explore a variety of approaches to understand and combat anti-Semitism. We truly appreciate their generosity. Today, our first speaker is, as I said, Professor Magda Teter, who is Professor of History and the Schwiedler Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham University. She is the author of Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, Sinners on Trial, Jews and Sacrilege After the Reformation, Blood Libel, about which she'll be speaking today, On the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Anti-Semitism and Racism, which just came out last year, and dozens of articles in English, Hebrew, Italian, and Polish. Professor Teter's essays have also appeared in the New York Review of Books, Public Seminar, Huffington Post, and many others. Her book, Blood Libel, won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award, the George L. Massey Prize from the American Historical Association, and the Ronald Bainton Prize for 16th Century Society from the 16th Century Society, pardon me. She's also received fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the H.F. Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and many others. She is currently president of the American Academy of Jewish Research. As I said, I'm very excited for this lecture. This is an extremely important topic, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Professor Teter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I had some disturbance when Jennifer was introducing me. I'm delighted and honored to be part of the Shoah Foundation public program. I'm going to share my screen with you because there will be a lot of images that I want to show you. As a beginning, I want to say that as a scholar of the pre-modern period, I did not realize how or didn't or wish my work was not that that relevant as it is today. But when my book was coming, my book on blood libel was about to go into production. An event took place in California, not far from where many of you are, the Poway Synagogue shooting. And the shooter published a manifesto in which he mentioned a character and around whom centered. He wrote, and this is the highlighted part of it, you are not forgotten, Simon of Trent. The horror that you and countless children have endured at the hands of the Jews will never be forgiven. So the work that I was doing about the long centuries-old canard that Jews killed Christian children, alive, my book was being prepared. I had to change my introduction to include this this passage and the mention of this event, and sadly the work and the myth is relevant not only in the fringes of the society, but now increasingly, thanks to social media, more broadly. And I'm just going to bring you examples to how these stories from the medieval and early modern period, this is the Simon of Trent, the broadside of Simon of Trent that the shooter mentioned, have continued. Here is an example of a reference to blood libels by British far right and Czech far right groups, and here was a Facebook page that was devoted to ritual murder, which took 4 years after the ADL requested its removal for Facebook to remove. And then after my book was already published in 2020, an artist in Italy painted this painting to in his mind celebrate the death of this the boy that we'll learn a little bit more about today. So those stories have long legs, and then of course there is the iconography of blood libels that is widely disseminated in the Middle East. Here you have an example from 2014, and here is an example just from after October 7th this year. Here's just one of many, and you can find more on the ADL has collected some of those cartoons. So the questions, how did a medieval tale like that take such deep root that it's in so many segments of our modern society. So just to give you a sense, in the modern medieval period, roughly, this is from the beginning of the accusation of the stories that emerged in the 12th until middle of the 15th century. That's what we may call the medieval period. You have a few dozen of these tales, and not necessarily actual accusations. Some of them were just legends or tales or rumors that were recorded in various chronicles, but nothing happened in these places, in many of these places. But the medieval period, aside from this rise of these stories and tales and accusations and rumors and these lies that Jews killed Christian children, also is studied by papal condemnations of these accusations, condemning Christians for accusing Jews of killing Christians. So we have both in the medieval period the rise of these tales, but also condemnations. And you will notice on the slide that the last condemnation is in the middle of the 16th century, and after that, none of them took place. So the other question we might say, is the blood libel then a medieval story? It's so deep. We see it today in so many places, and I see someone commented already about the harvesting, the tropes and lies of harvesting organs, and it sort of permeates and changes and transforms in different contexts. Is it then a medieval story? And when you look at the map, this is the period more or less that my book covers, and it's not even coming to today's memes and stories. You can see at the bottom of the timeline that the medieval period did not have that many of the accusations, but that the heights come in the 17th, late 16th and in the 17th century, and then it peters down in the 19th century, and then there is a resurgence in the late 19th century, about which other scholars have written. So how can we explain this story? And you will also notice there's also a qualitative difference, that there are legal and literary sources. And here is the contrast between the medieval period, where we have mostly literary sources and literary references, and the what we historians call the early modern period, from middle of the 15th century until the 19th century. And here we again have not only the numbers, far many more such accusations and charges, but also the qualitatively, we actually have legal sources. That means that actual accusations and charges and proceedings took place in various places. So we have this the story of lies and tales and rumors being turned into facts. Some of them also by contemporary scholars and their representation on maps of confusion between what were the tales, what were the stories, what were the literary sources, and what were the actual accusations where Jews were accused and suffered for these tales. And again, the medieval period, mostly stories, very few actual trials, actual proceedings, and the early modern period is not only the majority of the legal sources, but actually the proceedings, and the majority of this, we actually can talk about legal cases, court cases against Jews. But where all these stories ending in the death of Jews and the answer is a little bit more complicated, even though if anybody knows anything about these accusations, if one would ask a person who might know, did the majority of these accusations end in the persecution of Jews and death of Jews? The likely answer would have been yes. And there is a reason why we remember, why we think that the majority of those cases against Jews ended in persecution, killing of Jews, and when historically this is actually not quite true. There were fewer of those cases that ended with the execution of Jews, and one of the reasons is that what has been publicized, what has been known in printed sources, about which I'll talk in a moment, are the stories about and the cases in which Jews are executed and killed and punished for those supposed crimes that they supposedly committed. And the reason is for that most of those sources, the printed sources, come from Christians who are eager to show Jews' guilt, and are not interested in showing that Jews were in fact found innocent of those accusations. That doesn't serve the purpose. So the stories or the actual cases in which Jews were found innocent are often now buried in the archives, and very few people know about them, except for historians like myself who dig and go into the archives. The other thing that is important is to think about the impact of the papal condemnations. And here you can see from the period when the popes actually did make strong condemnations of the accusation. Yes, we can see that they took place, but the number is far smaller than after the condemnations stopped. So one may ask a question, why in the 16th century the popes ended condemning the Jews, and why it then helped the proliferation of what emerged in the medieval period as a tale to actual trials and persecution of Jews in the early modern period. And the answer is the impact of the trial of Jews in 1475. The same story seems to have been one of the reasons cited by the shooter in Poway, and its impact and part of the story that led to these proliferatory accusations. So let me briefly tell you about the story. So in March 1475, during the Easter week, this toddler named Simon disappeared. It was about 26 months old. He disappeared, and the family thought that he may have drowned, perhaps in one of the many canals in Trento, in the northern Italian town. And there were rumors that perhaps Jews may have killed him. Their houses immediately they searched the canals, they couldn't find the body. And then on Easter Sunday, which was the 4th day of Passover, actually, the body washed up under the house of the Jew Samuel, who you see here on this broadside. The community the Jewish males were immediately arrested and then subjected to interrogations and torture. And some of them eventually under torture confessed to a crime that they did not commit and were executed, and women and children were put under house arrest, and then after a few years next year tried, and then eventually they all were forced or converted to Christianity, effectively ending the presence of Jews in that town. But when you look at the date 1475, there are two important aspects of that date. One is it comes in just a couple of decades after the invention of the printing press and the new technology, new mass media. It's the first time when we can not only disseminate, also for the first time, mass production of images. And here is one of those images that contributes to the dissemination of the story. And the other one is that 1475 was a Jubilee year in the Catholic calendar, and there were many pilgrims who were traveling to Rome on a pilgrimage, and where the bishop of the town was eager to attract them to come to Trento. And having a relic, a martyr, who the bishop and the stories were claiming had healing powers, was we might call today a tourist attraction, but was an attraction for pilgrims and pious people, and was then promoted by the bishop through this new technology of printing. The other thing that is important to note is that the bishop really invested a lot of money in the process of dissemination of the story. And the story was written and the narrative was set already before the Jews, the arrested Jews began to be tortured and confessed. So the narrative was set by this man, Johannes Matthias Tiberinus, who was a physician at the court of the bishop, and who wrote the first narrative already on March 31st. That is about a week after the child's body was found, and they began to collect supposed miracles that took place around his body, which actually other archival documents show that they were fraudulent, and putting them in print and disseminating the story. So the narrative was set before any of the Jews confessed to anything in the process. And then the trial records were gradually transformed, and we can read them if we read them chronologically to align written by Mattia Tiberino. What is also important is that this is the first case where we have images. So one of the earliest images, printed images in European or really world history of Jews, are those coming out of Trento in the wake of this trial of Jews. I have a booklet that was published with a text of 12 woodcuts and text. This is what it looks like: 1 page of text, 1 page of image, that tells the story of Simon, supposedly kidnapped by Jews, then murdered by Jews as a sacrifice on Passover, Easter, in reenactment of Jesus's crucifixion. And here you have the story being told through images, and first time in the history of printing. What that wide dissemination of images and these stories meant, that in a very new type of genre that just flourishes with the invention of the printing press, history books that tell the story of the world. This story of the death of Simon and the trial of Jews enters these big narratives of world history as they were conceived by these historiographers of the 15th century. And here you have pages showing you the story from the late 15th, early 16th century. Here's perhaps the most famous chronicle, printed chronicle, the Nuremberg Chronicle. And if anybody has read anything about blood libels or quote unquote ritual murder, I'd rather use the phrase murder libel than ritual murder, because that phrase ritual murder has a complicated modern history, and I can talk about it later. But that image becomes iconic in the modern period, modern anti-Semitic iconography. It is, however, an image that is forgotten in the early modern period. I tracked all the chronicles and all the stories and the way which stories about Jews and about Simon entered which chronicles in my work at the New York Public Library. The other item that is important is that although in 1475, the Pope condemned the trial of Jews and reminded the bishop about the papal condemnations of such accusations, by 1583, Simon and his cult is recognized by the Catholic Church. So he is the first child who was supposed to be a victim of the Jews that is formally recognized as a subject of veneration by the Church, and is inserted in a liturgical calendar, the Romanum, in 1583, right after the Gregorian reform of the calendar in general terms. So it enters it in a very pivotal moment for history. And this is what happens after the recognition by the Church of the cult of Simon. You can see the rise of trials again of Jews accused of killing Christian children. So it really mattered what the church did or didn't do. The other thing is, as I mentioned, the printing press is the role of this trial in the development of the iconographic language of these anti-Jewish accusations. Before that, before the Trent trial, there are really no iconographic there's no iconographic evidence of representations of these even medieval tales. But here we have an invention of the language, of the visual language of representation of these accusations. It is showing Jews in the act of killing, as you can see here. It is showing the dead figure of Simon. the Simon as a victim of Jews. And then in Italy in particular, the image of Simon as victorious and in conversation and really echoing the iconography of Jesus and Jesus's resurrection. And the reason for it is that in the various rhetoric and poems and tales about Simon compared to Christ. And again, and there is a very clear geographic distribution. In Italy, on the Italian peninsula, we have a focus on Simon as this sort of glorious figure, and Simon in glory with the halos, and really very little of the gory items, because the Italians were interested in promoting his cult, and also they were interested in converting Jews. Whereas in the northern European, north of the Alps, we have a focus on much more gory aspects of the story. We have the representations of the dead body of Simon, often in combination with derogatory representations of Jews. This image here on the right represents the image that was visible at the entry gate to Frankfurt until the 19th century, and it is frequently shown in publications. As I mentioned, this image is popular, very popular now in both scholarly and anti-Semitic publications, but it was actually quite forgotten, and instead different type of iconography showing Jews and supposedly killing Simon, and you can see here the various versions of that image, and similar ones were proliferating throughout Europe. And here is another example of that iconographic representation that will later on be used also in the modern period. And again, that typology of Jews in the act becomes repeated and repeated throughout and across in Northern Europe, both in German lands and in Eastern Europe. So how are facts made out of lies and rumors? And are facts really facts? One of the role that these stories, these tales become, and rumors become facts, is the role of what I mentioned, these chronicles, these printed chronicles that really become a popular genre. And what we see in these chronicles, we see a number of tales that enter and are included in these chronicles of the history of the world. And all of them, for the post-biblical history of Jews, are negative, pejorative, that show Jews as either being punished for something that they did, or reporting these rumors and stories as if they were facts in the history of the world. So here you have from the Nuremberg Chronicle, from which we've seen the iconic image. There are about a dozen stories talking about Jews being expelled from France, Jews desecrating the Holy Sacrament, Jews being burned in Germany for poisoning springs during the Black Death, and so on and so forth, including Jews killed a boy named Simon in the city of Trent. So you can see this vocabulary is very negative, always showing Jews as doing something and then being punished for that. And then that's across all this type of European chronicles and books. So the tales and stories enter what were considered serious books about history and are included as if they were facts, and they become ingrained as facts in the European imagination, in the imagination of the reading public of Europe. And that's important to remember. That wasn't just in Catholic writers, it was also Protestant writers. A very famous Protestant scholar, Sebastian Münster, who also knew Hebrew, included these stories in his description of the world and in describing the various towns he was writing about. And this is a description of France and the expulsion of Jews from France, and you can see an image of a crucified child. And these chronicles would often signal stories about Jews, and there are, again, about a dozen or 2 dozen of those stories. But for a reader, the reader would be immediately drawn to them because they were signaled through some kind of imagery. Here is about poisoning wells. And again, I can't underemphasize the role the tales enter as they enter here the liturgical calendar in a much the same way as these chronicles. Here with the liturgical calendar, the story of Simon of Trent becomes a fact approved by the church in an authoritative calendar. But this is an interesting case here of how these facts are distorted as they enter. So this is a page from a very big history of the church that was published by, initially was authored by, oh my gosh, I have a brain freeze. By Baronio, Cesare Baronio, I'm sorry, big volumes, one volume per century, more or less, and it was then continued by other scholars. And the characteristic of this history, and there are 12 big volumes, is that they include primary sources. And here the page I am showing you is that Odorico Rinaldi mentions for 1247 that the Pope and quotes the papal bull condemning anti-Jewish accusations. But as I said, this history was big, massive, massive volumes. Nobody could own it. Maybe monastic libraries could. So entrepreneurial printers created abridged editions. And what do they throw out is they throw out the primary sources. In this case, they threw out the text of the bull condemning these anti-Jewish accusations and only included the little sentence introducing it, saying that in 1247, Jews were accused of killing a Christian girl in this town of Valderea. So what enters the kind of public history and public memory is the fact that Jews were accused of killing the Christian girl, and not that the popes condemned these accusations. And that's how these schools turn rumors and stories into facts. And as my friend, writer Georgy Gospodinov, whose book Time Shelter I highly recommend, writes, happiness doesn't make it into history textbooks, nor does it make it into the chronicles and annals. And that is very true. The chronicles and annals record the unusual, the strange, and that included these anti-Jewish stories. But what it means is that these tales, as they become quote unquote facts and these chronicles, then serve as evidence of the Jews' propensity, supposed propensity to kill Christian children. And then they serve as evidence, especially in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in courts, as evidence against Jews when they have been, may have been found dead, and then Jews may have been accused. What these chronicles do, and what I hope I showed you, and then I discuss more in much more detail in my book, is, as the scholar George L. Mossy said, that culture, they become embedded in culture and then created certain habits of thinking about Jews. So these chronicles, for people who may not have been anti-Jewish in any ways, but who were reading about history, suddenly they encounter Jews in that history, but only through these anti-Jewish libels, through these negative anti-Jewish lies and stories. And today we see these pre-modern stories, not just today, but in the modern times, they were also used in anti-Semitic modern propaganda. So here you have, and again, the example we've seen from the Nuremberg Chronicle by Hartmann Schedel from 1472, and these facts, quote unquote, that Schedel shows us in the Chronicle, enter then the anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda. In May 1934, the Nazi rag Der Stürmer published a whole issue devoted to essentially the blood libels, although for them they were not libels, they were showing it as a supposed Jewish plan, conspiracy plan. And what they did in that issue is a whole issue devoted to anti-Jewish, these murder libels, is that they looked in the pre-modern chronicles. This is what was so, if I may say so, brilliant about Nazi propaganda, that they wanted to show their readers that they are not making this up, but they are grounding it in historical evidence. And you can recognize some of the images here that they published, the Simon of Trent image from 1493. Here they printed an image of from Rydell, from which we also have seen, and then they have several of the very analytic, that is very kind of year by year, like these pre-modern chronicles, supposed facts. In this year, Jews did this. In this year, Jews did this. The list of ritual murders from the times of Christ till 1932. So what they have done is they essentially have pulled those pre-modern sources and used them in their anti-Semitic propaganda. Once those images and those stories entered the Nazi sort of ecology of knowledge, if you will, it entered other publications through anti-Semitic publications. Here you have an Italian fast publication, La Difesa della Razza, which is sort of like their Sturmer, except that it's much more highbrow than the lowbrow type of publication that touches things much more in research and scientific language than in the sort of screed-like publication as their Sturmer was. And then at the height of the murder of Jews, the so-called final solution, the Nazis again began to publish books and reinforcing these stories as part of the justification for what they were doing to show their readers how horrible Jews were. And again, you can see the use of those of those 15th century, 16th century imagery that we've seen earlier that I was talking. And it is through that Nazi publications that the current neo-Nazis and the Middle Eastern propagandists get their imagery and their stories. The Poway synagogue shooter didn't study early modern chronicles and didn't read books about Simon of Trent. He sides. Der Stürmer has a website in English and used it. Similarly, in the Middle East, that anti-Semitic propaganda couched in the anti-Israeli propaganda also enters through this the Nazi propaganda, and there is a direct line with Johannes van Leer, who in fact and later on converts to Islam and becomes one of the chief propagandists in Egypt against Israel. So again, these are not coming. There's no direct line, direct line from the pre-modern period to Poway or to the Middle East. There is a sort of a line from the modern use of the pre-modern stories through the Nazi reservoir of propagandistic sources. So are there lessons? I'm going to start wrapping up. Are there lessons to be learned? One lesson I think that is important is that leadership matters and public statements matter. Again, public statements, whether they are inflammatory or actually with moral leadership, matter because they influence acts, they influence the larger public. And here again, we've seen this map before. This is the anti-Jewish libels during the time of papal condemnations, and the anti-Jewish libels after the Pope stopped condemning Jews. Yes, there were some during the papal condemnations, but nonetheless, those who wanted to defend Jews or those who didn't want to prosecute them had a moral and legal framework in which to resist. That was much more difficult when the popes stopped condemning these accusations. The other lesson, especially so crucial for our times when we live in echo chambers, when we're subjected to onslaught, especially on social media, especially algorithm driven information, misinformation, and disinformation, is that diverse sources of knowledge matter. And this map in particular can be explained not just by these papal pronouncements that I highlighted for you, but also on the type of knowledge and literature that was accessible to the readers at the time. So you'll notice that there is very little in what is Germany now. And that is because the German readers had books about Jews. They were polemical books. They ridiculed Jewish observances, but nonetheless, they had scholars who knew Hebrew, who knew and could read Jewish sources, and who were able to discredit these anti-Jewish accusations, sometimes very directly and sometimes indirectly, like Johannes Buxtorf, for instance, in his book about Jewish practices, ceremonies. When he described Passover, he just mentioned that the matzah is made of water and flour, and he says nothing else. And he says not even salt or oil is added. And then he puts a note, and it doesn't even taste good. And then again, that's obviously his opinion. Some would disagree, but they were able to say, no, these are ridiculous accusations. In Italy as well, we have scholars who knew Hebrew and who are reading it. But in Italy, what we also have is that we have interest in converting Jews, and these Catholic, the clergy and scholars were saying, if you do accuse Jews of these ridiculous crimes, they will never convert. They will never take us seriously. They will never convert. So here, the desire to convert Jews to Catholicism meant that they were less interested in these anti-Jewish tales and libels, and were more interested in arguing and in engaging in a polemic about the truth of Jesus as the Messiah. And that explains that iconography. In Eastern Europe, in Poland in particular, the only liturgy is the one that repeats these anti-Jewish stories based on those chronicles. We do not have any literature that is informed about Jewish customs, and so the readers would take these supposedly learned books and use them and as evidence. In fact, the ones that when we see Jews being defended is the illiterate Christians who know Jews as neighbors, who maybe even live in the same houses with Jews, and who say that Jews do not do such things. So again, that's what explains this map. The other lesson that we have is that visual culture matters. These, little boys, where you really have to look at what's happening on the image, that there's blood, there is knife, there are all kinds of things, are not as inflammatory unless it's, the story. This is very different for the iconography that is popular in Northern Europe, that is very inflammatory. So what we see, it matters, and how we see it, it matters. And the final lesson that I want to say, reiterate that there was no uninterrupted line of these stories. The chronicles, this imagery was not as popular, but it enters modern scholarly publications, and then when there are modern accusations, scholars then draw on these pre-modern sources, both those who defend Jews, publishing the papal bulls, and those who accuse Jews. And here we have Cecil Roth publishing a document defending Jews from the 18th century in response to their Stürmer. And that also is true for the anti-Semites, who also go to the archives and pull out some of these stories to the archives, entering the sort of modern story. Is there hope? This is my last point. I think there is. Even in these dark times, we have to believe that there's hope. And I think one of the models that we could still use for the modern time is the process of reconciliation that took place between the Catholic Church and the Jewish community, where the dominant medieval dominant synagogue looking at the humiliated ecclesia, the dominant ecclesia, the church, looking at the humiliated synagogue, the Jewish religion, Judaism, is now represented on equal terms as the two queens who can learn from each other. So I'll stop here, and I'll be eager to hear what you have to say.
Wonderful. Magda, thank you so much for that really, really interesting and informative talk. I know as somebody who teaches some of this in my own classes, I have so much new material that I can bring to my students that they're going to find interesting in the future. We actually have quite a few questions, so I'm gonna just kind of read down the list. Our first question is, why are Spain and Portugal not mentioned in the maps?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I've been called on that by my colleagues who are Iberianists and say, why not? And I'll tell you why not, because I looked at the dissemination of the stories, especially in the early modern period through the press. And I started actually going on the Iberian Trail. I looked in these various Iberian published chronicles from the early modern period, and some of the anti-Jewish books that were authored by Iberian scholars. And interestingly, they don't mention. There's one case that is mentioned, Castile, and to be honest with you, I didn't know how to put it on the map. should have, but there's only one story that's mentioned in these various chronicles, European chronicles, that the Iberian legend don't make it into the European kind of knowledge of these tales. It is and the story the story that emerges, for instance, El Niño de la Guardia, is a fruit of the and really a product of the Simon of Trent story. That it's only now that scholars, Paula Tartakov and others, that have begun to look into the archives and digging out some of those archival stories. So that map has to be updated.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to our second question.
And Jennifer, you break up for me. I don't know whether you break up for everybody, but I sometimes don't hear you well. So I apologize for that.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm hoping that this will come through. I'm in a room at the Shoah Foundation. I'm wondering if the walls are impeding this a little bit. The second question is, how were these early publications disseminated? Who was their audience, especially given that most people didn't read? And he also, the questioner also says these early iconic images were certainly very graphic. And I'm going to dovetail on that with my own question. Can you tell us a little bit about your sources and how you go about doing your research?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a fantastic question, and it shows you the sort of the power of the intellectual class, right? So one thing that is commonly thought is that these accusations were of those like uneducated, riffraff, and they were going, and that's not true. That troop of the riffraff and uneducated comes in the Enlightenment era. And it really, in the before the Enlightenment, it's all the educated class, those who can read, who become the vessels. There is obviously oral history, oral traditions. People talk, people convey these stories orally, absolutely, and they can be activated. But the promoters are those who can read, who can write, who can, to use a 21st century word, who can weaponize it in such way. Who was the audience? Obviously, the audience was literate and affluent individuals, and the chronicles were massive, so they had to have money to buy these things. This was not cheap pamphlet books. They come later. Now with Simon, they are cheap pamphlets or one sheet kind of publications that the pilgrims can take with them and carry them home. So that the bishop is very smart, because he tries to reach out both the lower class people who are visiting Trento, and also make sure that the intellectuals get the story through these chronicles, through poems in classical, modeled on Virgil and classical Latin. So that's the readers. Exactly, the readers didn't, there were not too many readers in early modern Europe. The question about sources is interesting. When I started writing this book, I really didn't intend to make it that big, but I began to unravel. I essentially followed the trail that the sources were taking me. I started with a different question, and I ended up in a different place with it. And I happened to read 10 languages, so I happened to not be able to kind of just said, oh, I can't look at that because I can't read it. So I've worked with both primary sources, archival sources, looking at trial records, looking at the church responses in the Vatican archives, now it used to be called the Secret Vatican Archives. Now it's an Apostolic Vatican Archives, in various local archives where I knew from the list of where supposedly this trial happens, whether there was any archival document. And then I worked with iconography, and the story with the iconography is that I worked on a case that took place in Poland, in 18th century Poland, And there are paintings that are still preserved in this town. And then I saw a book in Italy with just like a fragment of a painting. I'm like, that looks like my the paintings in that town. And this was not. This was a fragment of a painting of Simon of Trent. And I realized that I need to pay more attention to the art and the dissemination of art and the typology that it produces and then transmits across Europe.
Okay. Thank you. We have a couple of people who have asked about the fate of Simon of Trent, whether or not it's ever been established what happened to him. And then one person said they wonder whether or not, if his fate can be firmly established, if that might have been a way to counter anti-Semitic myths and the lies surrounding his fate.
Yes, and that's a great question. And and as you were asking the question, I said, "Oh, I should have had another slide and my slide," and that's showing that the cult was abolished in 1965. By on the same day as the Nostra Aetate declaration was issued. So it's no longer there, but there are still because the town was so the cult was so embedded in the town, there are still iconographic sort of material remnants of that cult in Trento. The question of what happened to him, we don't know what happened. He may have just fallen into a ditch and a canal and died. That's possible. He may have been murdered by, and if there is a murderer, that's one of the servants who helps search for Simon when he disappears. Not a Jewish servant, but a guy who is indebted to the Jewish family, to one of the Jewish families, and he then tries to help the father to find the body, but he has a very sort of strange story, and it's possible that perhaps he was the murderer. So we don't know. It's an interesting question that I want to just make a comment. When I was writing this book, and actually the chapter trying to retell what happened in Trent in 1475, I had to start writing it several times, because I realized that the way we've been telling the story is we've been telling the story through the documents that the bishop who wanted to promote the cult preserved. So we are, in fact, telling the story by the person who condemned Jews, as the person who condemned the Jews wanted the story to be told. So what I decided to do is I decided to think about the materials that have been preserved, and there's a mass of materials, and look at what can we know for fact, and what is clearly part of the narrative that was created by the bishop and his cronies. And what we know for the fact is that a child disappears, that his body is found, that Jews are accused, and that the Jewish community is destroyed. These are the facts we know. We don't know what happened to him. We know that the narrative about the matzah doesn't work because that the child was alive the first 4 days of Passover. So I really rewrote it. And the other thing that I did, and this is, I think, important in the way words and sentences, including of serious scholars, are often now taken out of context, is that when I was writing it, I was trying, and I don't know whether I succeeded, but I was trying not to have a single sentence that could be taken as a string, that could be taken out of context, saying Magda Teder says that Jews killed Christian children, or that Jews killed Simon. So I would break up these sentences and I would say, Jews, the bishop argued, or the bishop charged were guilty of Simon's death or something like that, because we only know the story, how it is told by those who were disseminating that story. We actually don't know what happened. We know what the bishop wants us to know.
So there are two questions that are semi-related to this. So let me ask the first one. A person asks, wasn't the Kielce pogrom of 1946 triggered by a claim that Jews kidnapped a little Polish boy who was later released for ritual purpose?
Yes, that is correct. And that's it. Another example that I could have used in my many slides of how that tale, those lies are so deep rooted that they're able to be to be used to trigger violence. And the Kielce pogrom, there are Polish scholars who have done very serious analysis of the pogrom. It was in fact triggered by a claim by a boy who actually turned up alive, who left the town, that Jews hit him, killed him, tried to kill him, and I mean, he disappears, and there's the rumor that they killed him in a cellar, the cellar that doesn't exist. The boy turns up alive, and it's both, I think, the evidence of the deep-rootedness of those and the power of that modern propaganda, but I also think it is a product of the refreshing that memory by the Nazi propaganda. And one of those images that I showed you was a Polish language publication, The Truth About Ritual Murder, with Simon in that. So it sort of refreshes the memory of those accusations during World War II for the Poles.
Okay. I'm gonna take out of part of your comment here and where you talk about how deep rooted this myth is. And I'm gonna ask another one of our attendees questions. They want to know how do we counter contemporary iterations of the blood libel? I know you ended your talk with, is there hope? So maybe you can go into that a little bit.
So I think there is hope in us working and through education. I am at a loss, I have to confess, at the onslaught of the social media and the various memes. How do we counter that? This particular story is a tough one because the arguments that we can use were known for centuries. They are cited in the 1247 bull by Pope Innocent IV, saying Jews do not kill Christians because they can't consume any blood. They, and so on. So we've known the argument why, but it's clearly not very effective. And one of the problems, I think, that is a larger problem of how we may need to rethink our approach to anti-Semitism, which I have been certainly thinking about since October 7th in a deeper way, is that, and this talk is one of those, we focus on how these anti-Semitic ideas are disseminated, what they say, but by doing so, we are also amplifying them, even though we are discounting them, even though we are debunking them, even though we are showing what the mechanisms are. And what we're not doing enough is we are not doing enough of the focus on what these anti-Semitic ideas do to Jews and as human beings here, and what is in fact the stereotypes. The reason I think why this one is so particularly powerful is that it has in itself the combination of conspiracy, of bloodthirstiness, which also go back to the uses and abuses of Christian scriptures, and then in the anti-Israel propaganda, the pain and the horrifying effects of war, of violence during war, that then are just weaponized to come together in that one story, and the sort of the capacious ability of the story to morph and transform is as over centuries is really interesting, from the reenactment of the crucifixion to bloodthirstiness, to then in the modern period of the focuses are actually on killing women, when women become much freer and women become more independent and maybe enter the possibility of a more open society, means entering inter-religious relations and things like that, then is transformed into yet another version of the story. And then today we're witnessing yet another version of the story in the anti-Israeli propaganda.
Thank you. You touched upon a couple of things that another one of our questioners address, but going back into the early modern period, they say that it sounds like many early modern scholars were aware of these libels and accusations against Jews, and that they were false, and that many people's many people who were living among or in proximity to Jews also realized that they were fake. And this person is wondering, were they just unwilling to hear that these were false? And in some ways, it's similar to today with the social media posts and whatnot. That they're in a sort of early modern echo chamber, if you will.
I think this is right. There's an early modern echo chamber, but I think the map I showed you, that in majority of the cases and accusations, Jews were actually not executed, that they were spared or let free, shows us that some people did hear it. And that's evidence of that they would believe that Jews did not do such things. And when, just like today, the horrific is that's what was amplified, and it was amplified because it served the interests of those who wanted the story to be true, whether because they accused Jews and they didn't want their accusation to look false. And we actually have a number of those for instance, from Poland, where in the aftermath of a trial of Jews, which is very rancorous. There are defenders of Jews, but there are also accusers, and then sadly, Jews in this case are executed. The writer feels the need, the accuser feels the need to publish a whole book to prove that he was right, that Jews had done it, and he uses both the published books from before, the published stories, but he also goes to the archives and digs out the examples of Jews being condemned, because he wants to show that in other cases Jews were also condemned. He is not pulling out the stories and the cases when Jews were deemed innocent, which were filed in their defense, but he amplifies those in which Jews are deemed guilty, were deemed guilty. So yes, there is this echo chamber, and that yes, there were those who didn't believe, and yes, there were those who defended them, but there were also those who had access to printing and who were eager and willing to publish those stories, which are those that remain with us as sort of physical evidence of that past.
Thank you for that. We turn now to a slightly more simple question, but I think it's also a really good question that maybe not many people are actually like know about. How did people who believed that Jews were guilty of blood libel make sense of the fact that Jesus was a Jew and therefore, quote unquote, guilty of the crimes other Jews were accused of?
So first, I don't think people were thinking about Jesus as Jewish too much at this time. Although Luther, again, that's Protestant, wrote that Jesus was born a Jew in this way. But the story that mattered for them was not that Jesus was Jewish, is that in the Passover, Easter liturgy and in the iconography, Jews were portrayed as at least implicated, if not guilty of, killing Jesus, right? And you have that in theological texts, that Jews are condemned to their exile, to their wandering, for what Christian theologians claim was the crime of killing Jesus. So the deicide plays a role, much less the consciousness of thinking about Jesus as being Jewish. It's that story that becomes amplified and re-amplified, which is why it's the one that becomes centered in the Catholic Jewish reconciliation, is to affirm that Jews were not involved in this, right? That's one of the passages in the Nostra Aetate document that quote unquote absolves Jews of that supposed historical charge.
Okay, thank you. Another question we got, somebody's wondering if you could maybe talk about possible connections between the blood libel and the protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Okay, so there is a little bit of a connection, because the protocols of the Elders of Zion are composed, and Steven Zipperstein has shown it in his book about the Kishinev pogrom, by someone who is involved in the propaganda against Jews that leads to the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. And the Kishinev pogrom also is one of those modern pogroms that is a product of a blood libel accusation. So yes, there is that connection, and of course this hoax publication by this anti-Semitic writer and an agitator also amplifies this idea of Jewish conspiracies and Jewish power. So there is definitely both the authorship that connects the blood libel, but also the context of the Kishinev pogrom and the people who are involved in it connects it to that publication.
Okay, thank you very much. We're quickly coming to the end here, and if you have any last questions for Professor Teta, I would encourage you to write them in right now. I will tell you, we've had so many people write in and tell us how much they've enjoyed this and how much they've learned.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ask one question and see if anybody else chimes in here as well. Can you maybe talk about the gendered aspect of this? As the gender historian in me, of course, wants to know. So many of the images are of men, but I'm curious how women figure into the blood libel.
It's a very interesting question. And the only woman who ever gets implicated in that is Brunetta, and you could see her in that iconic image from the Nuremberg Chronicle and also the broadside that I showed you a couple of times. But it is true that the only that the perpetrators are always men. Those who the perpetrators are always portrayed as men, and also the men that are usually accused, if there is such an accusation, is the men. And the reason for it is that the men are the leaders of the community. They are the ones who are most well known, the rabbis or the community leaders. They are the ones whose names might come up, someone might remember, rather than just some average or non-existent person. It also helps that, again, that aspect of conspiracy, that it is the powerful leaders who are planning and plotting these crimes, not some random poor Jew who doesn't know anything. So that is definitely the knowledge and the power of the community leaders is what is played. The only time when we see women mentioned in any of that, like in the Simon of Trent story, is supposedly trying to keep him quiet or giving him food or that kind of aspect. Brunetta, on the other hand, is amplified for two reasons. One, she is the wife of Samuel, under whose house the body washed up. She's also very active in his business affairs. So she's very visible to the Christians in this section of the town. And finally, she is the one, and actually in one of those images, she's the one who has a sack of money by her, because the family, the Samuel and Brunetta, were local moneylenders, one of the local moneylenders. So she is seen as the central character. But finally, she is the one who perhaps is the only one who is tortured and doesn't confess, doesn't break. And the bishop is actually furious. He wants her he wants her to confess, and he wants her to convert, and she's the one who neither confesses and neither converts. So she's amplified in that story.
Very, very interesting. We don't have any more new questions, so I think that to give you a bit of a break, we'll go ahead and end everything here. I want to thank you again, Professor Magda Teser, for an absolutely wonderful, wonderful and fascinating lecture. Thank you to everybody who came and attended. We had a lot of people here today, that's very, very promising. I also just want to thank Daniel and Marissa Classigan for their support of this anti-Semitism lecture series. And anybody who registered will be receiving a link for an on-demand recording of this video if they're interested in watching it for a second time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And if anybody has any other questions, if you think of anything else later on, feel free to reach out to me. I'm very easily found with a name like that. You can Google me and you can find me. But you saw my email earlier in the slide. It's mtetter@fordham.edu. So feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to be here. Thank you.